The photograph was taken in the summer of 1938. 5 faces stare back through time, their eyes hollow, their smiles forced. The Carter family of Millbrook, Tennessee. Within 3 years, 4 of them would be dead. The 5th would spend the rest of her life in an asylum, whispering the same prayer over and over until her voice gave out. The official records say it was a murder-suicide. The neighbors say something else entirely. They say the Carters heard God speaking to them through their walls. They say the family stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped living in any recognizable way. And they say that whatever answered their prayers wasn't holy at all. This is the story the town of Millbrook buried. The story that appears in no history books, that gets whispered about only when the bourbon comes out and the lights go down. This is the story of what happens when faith becomes indistinguishable from madness, when devotion curdles into something unspeakable. Hello, everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The Carter family claimed to hear the voice of God. Thomas Carter, 42, a railroad supervisor known for his stern discipline and unwavering faith. His wife, Margaret, 39, a church organist whose hymns could supposedly bring grown men to tears. Their 3 children, Elizabeth, 16, Samuel, 14, and young Grace, only 9 years old. By all accounts, they were pillars of their community, devout, respectable, unremarkable. But something changed in the spring of 1939. Something that started as religious fervor and ended in blood. The question isn't whether the Carters believed they were speaking to God. The question is what spoke back, and why, even now, 86 years later, people in Millbrook still won't walk past the ruins of the Carter house after dark. They won't tell you why. They'll just shake their heads and change the subject. But the silence itself tells you everything you need to know. This is that story, the one they don't want told. It started with the radio. In March of 1939, Thomas Carter brought home a Philco Cathedral radio, one of those tall wooden models that sat like furniture in the parlor. The family would gather around it each evening after supper, listening to sermons broadcast from Nashville, to gospel programs, to the voices of preachers who promised salvation through the crackling static. Margaret Carter wrote in a letter to her sister that the radio had brought the Lord's voice directly into our home. She said it felt like a blessing. She said Thomas would sit inches from the speaker, his eyes closed, his lips moving in silent prayer. But by April, something had shifted. The neighbors noticed it first. The Carters stopped coming to Sunday service at First Methodist. This was unthinkable. Thomas Carter had never missed a Sunday in 20 years. When Reverend Holloway went to their house to check on them, Margaret answered the door but wouldn't let him inside. She told him they were receiving their sermons directly now. She said they didn't need the church anymore because God had chosen to speak to them personally. Holloway later told the county sheriff that Margaret's eyes looked fever-bright, that she seemed both ecstatic and terrified at the same time. Thomas had stopped going to work. His supervisor at the railroad, a man named Dutch Hennigan, drove out to the Carter property 3 times in May. Each time, Thomas met him at the door but refused to explain his absence. Dutch would later testify that Thomas looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. His clothes hung loose, his hands trembled, but his voice, Dutch said, was eerily calm. "I've been called to a higher service," Thomas told him. "The railroad doesn't matter anymore. Nothing matters but the voice." The voice. That's what the Carters started calling it. Their daughter Elizabeth confided in a schoolmate before she stopped attending classes entirely. She said her father would wake them in the middle of the night, gathering the family in the parlor to listen to the radio even when it wasn't turned on. He said he could hear instructions coming through the silence. He said God was teaching them how to prepare. For what? Elizabeth didn't know. She told her friend she was scared. She said her mother had started carving biblical verses into the wooden furniture with a kitchen knife. She said little Grace had stopped speaking altogether and would only communicate by humming hymns. By June of 1939, the entire family had vanished from public life. The general store owner noted that they stopped buying food. The mailman reported that their letters piled up, uncollected, until he stopped delivering them at all. A traveling salesman who knocked on their door in early July said he could hear singing from inside, dozens of voices layered over each other, though he knew only 5 people lived there. When no one answered, he peered through a window. He said every surface was covered, and in writing. Verses, prayers, strange symbols he didn't recognize. He never went back. There was one person who saw inside that house during those final months. One person who witnessed what the Carters had become. Her name was Sarah Winslow, and she was Margaret Carter's younger sister. She lived in Chattanooga, 60 miles away, and she hadn't spoken to Margaret since April when the letters stopped making sense. The last one she received was 7 pages long, written in handwriting so cramped and frantic it was barely legible. Margaret wrote about angels with too many eyes, about messages hidden in the static between radio stations, about how Thomas had been chosen as a prophet for the end times. Sarah burned that letter. She wishes now she'd kept it. In August of 1939, Sarah made the drive to Millbrook. She told herself she was overreacting, that Margaret was just going through a religious phase, that everything would be fine. She arrived at the Carter house on a Tuesday afternoon. The August heat was suffocating, cicadas screaming in the trees, but every window in the house was closed. Curtains drawn. The air around the property felt wrong somehow. Too still, too quiet despite the insects. Sarah knocked. No answer. She knocked again, calling Margaret's name. Finally, the door opened just a crack. It was Elizabeth. The girl was 17 now, should have been preparing for her final year of school. But the young woman who stared through that gap looked decades older. Her hair had been cut short, almost shaved. Her dress was stained, and her eyes, Sarah would later say, looked like someone had scooped out everything human and replaced it with something else. "You can't come in," Elizabeth whispered. "We're in preparation. The voice says we can't have outsiders during preparation." Sarah pushed past her anyway. What she found inside would haunt her for the remaining 43 years of her life. Every piece of furniture had been pushed against the walls. The floor was covered in words, written directly onto the hardwood in what looked like charcoal and dried blood. Biblical passages, yes, but also things Sarah had never seen in any scripture. Phrases in languages she didn't recognize. Diagrams that looked almost mathematical. Spiraling patterns that hurt to look at directly. The family was in the parlor. All of them. They sat in a circle around the radio, which wasn't turned on, which wasn't even plugged into the wall. Thomas was rocking back and forth, his lips moving constantly, soundlessly. Margaret's hands were raw and bleeding from writing, the pen still clutched in her fist. Samuel, 14 years old, was singing a hymn, but the melody was wrong, the notes bent into something discordant, and little Grace, only 10 now, sat perfectly still, staring at the silent radio with an expression of absolute terror. "Margaret," Sarah said. Her voice cracked. "Margaret, what's happened to you?" Margaret looked up. For just a moment, Sarah saw recognition flicker across her sister's face. Saw something human, trying to break through. Margaret opened her mouth, and Sarah thought she might actually speak, might actually ask for help. But then Thomas's hand shot out and gripped Margaret's wrist. He didn't look at Sarah. He didn't look at anything. His eyes were closed. "The voice doesn't want her here," Thomas said. "The voice says she'll contaminate the message." Sarah left. "She's ashamed of it," she told the investigators later. But she left. She got in her car and she drove back to Chattanooga, and she tried to convince herself it was just religious mania, just a family going through a difficult time. She told herself she'd come back with help, with a doctor, with someone who could make sense of what she'd seen. She never got the chance. September 14th, 1939. The night was moonless, thick with humidity that pressed down like a wet cloth over Millbrook. Most of the town was asleep. But 3 people were awake. 3 people heard what happened at the Carter house, though none of them could agree on exactly what they heard. Earl Pritchard lived a quarter mile down the road. He was a dairy farmer, used to waking before dawn, but that night something pulled him from sleep around 2 in the morning. He told the sheriff it was singing. Not hymns exactly, but something that started as hymns and then twisted into something else. Multiple voices, he said, far more than 5. They rose and fell in patterns that made his teeth ache, that made his dog hide under the porch and refuse to come out. The singing went on for nearly an hour, and then it stopped, just cut off mid-note, like someone had severed a rope. What came after the silence was worse. Earl said he heard screaming. A child's voice, he thought, high and desperate and filled with a terror so pure it didn't sound human anymore. It lasted maybe 30 seconds. Then another silence, this one so complete it felt like the world had stopped breathing. Earl stood on his porch in his nightshirt, staring toward the Carter property, trying to decide if he should go check. He was still deciding when he heard the gunshot. Just one, a single crack that echoed across the Tennessee hills and then faded into nothing. Mary Beth Cordell heard it too. She lived on the other side of the Carter property, close enough that her bedroom window faced their barn. She was nursing her infant son when the shot came. She said the sound made her milk curdle, made her baby stop crying and go rigid in her arms. She sat there in the dark, listening, waiting for another shot, for voices, for anything. But there was nothing, just the cicadas starting up again, hesitant at first, then building back to their normal chorus. The third witness was a drifter named Jack Lowell. He'd been sleeping in the Carter's barn without permission, had been there for 3 nights running. He was the only one who saw anything. He gave a statement to the sheriff before he left town, and that statement disappeared from the official record within a week. But Jack told his story to a bartender in Memphis 2 months later, and that bartender wrote it down. Jack said he woke to the sound of the back door opening. He peered through a gap in the barnwood and saw Thomas Carter walking into the yard. Thomas was barefoot, wearing only trousers and an undershirt. He was carrying something in his arms, something wrapped in a quilt. He walked to the well behind the house and stood there for a long moment, looking down into the darkness. Then he dropped whatever he was carrying. Jack heard the splash, heard Thomas stand there, breathing hard, whispering words Jack couldn't make out. Then Thomas went back inside. 5 minutes later came the singing. The terrible, wrong singing that made Jack want to run but kept him frozen in terror. When the singing stopped, Jack said he saw a light come on in the upstairs window. Just for a moment, a flickering, reddish light that looked like fire but moved like something alive. Then the gunshot, then darkness. Jack ran. He didn't stop running until he reached the main road 3 miles away. He hitched a ride on a truck heading toward Nashville and never came back to Millbrook. But before he left, he told the sheriff one more thing. He said that when Thomas Carter stood by the well, when he was whispering those words Jack couldn't hear, there was something wrong with his shadow. It was too long, he said. Too dark, and it moved independently, like it was trying to crawl away from Thomas's body but couldn't quite break free. At dawn, a neighbor finally worked up the courage to check on the Carters. The front door was unlocked. What they found inside would require the county coroner to request assistance from Nashville. Would require 3 men to quit the sheriff's department rather than process what they'd seen. Would require the local newspaper to run a front-page story with half the details omitted because the editor didn't believe anyone would accept the truth. 4 bodies, 1 survivor, and a mystery that the town of Millbrook has been trying to bury ever since. Sheriff Dale Womack had served Millbrook for 18 years. He'd seen bar fights and hunting accidents, and one particularly nasty case of domestic violence that still gave him nightmares. But nothing, he would later say, nothing in his entire career prepared him for what he found in the Carter house that morning. Thomas Carter was in the parlor. He'd placed the barrel of his hunting rifle under his chin and pulled the trigger. The ceiling told the rest of that story. But it was the way he'd arranged himself that disturbed Womack most. Thomas was sitting upright in a wooden chair, perfectly centered in the room, facing the radio. His eyes were still open, and even after death, even with half his head gone, there was an expression on what remained of his face that Womack described as rapture. Margaret Carter was upstairs in the bedroom she'd shared with Thomas. She was lying on the bed, her hands folded across her chest, like she'd been arranged for burial. At first, Womack thought she might be sleeping. Then he saw her lips. They were black, swollen. The empty bottle of lye soap was on the nightstand beside her. She'd drunk it. The coroner estimated it took her anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours to die. It would have been agony, every moment of it. But her face was peaceful, almost serene. Samuel was found in his bedroom, 14 years old. He'd hanged himself from the ceiling beam using a rope he'd apparently braided himself from strips of bedsheet. It would have taken hours to make that rope, hours of careful, methodical work. The chair he'd kicked away was placed precisely under his dangling feet, like he'd measured the distance, like he'd wanted to make sure there were no mistakes. On his desk was a note in his careful schoolboy handwriting. It said only, "The voice showed me what comes next. I choose this instead." Little Grace was not in the house. They found her 3 days later, in the well, wrapped in a quilt, weighted down with stones that had been carefully selected to be exactly the same size. She'd drowned. But the county coroner, a man named Dr. Howard Ellis, noted something in his private journal that never made it into the official report. Grace's lungs were full of water, yes, but her fingernails were broken and bloody. There was skin under them that didn't match her own, and there were bruises on her throat in the unmistakable pattern of adult male fingers. Grace Carter had not drowned quietly. She had fought. Someone had held her under. The fourth body was Elizabeth, 17 years old. They found her in the basement that shouldn't have been accessible because the Carters had never finished it, had never even put in a proper floor. But someone had been down there. Recently, there were candles burned down to nubs. There were more of those strange symbols carved into the dirt walls. And there was Elizabeth, curled in the corner, her arms wrapped around her knees. No visible wounds, no signs of violence. The coroner couldn't determine cause of death. Her heart had simply stopped. A 17-year-old girl in seemingly perfect health. Her heart had just given out, but it was her eyes that made the investigators refuse to go back down there. Elizabeth's eyes were open, and they were filled with blood. Not bloodshot. Filled, like every vessel had burst simultaneously. Like she'd seen something that her body simply couldn't process, something so terrible it had broken her from the inside out. The house itself told its own story. Every room, every surface, covered in writing. Biblical verses, yes, but corrupted somehow. Words changed, letters rearranged into configurations that hurt to read. The investigators tried to document it, tried to photograph the walls for evidence. But the photographs never came out right. They were overexposed or blurred, or showed shapes in the background that hadn't been there when the picture was taken. In the parlor, they found the radio. It was sitting where it always sat, unplugged, covered in a layer of dust. But when Deputy Frank Morrison picked it up to bag as evidence, it was warm. Not hot, just warm. Like it had been running recently. Like something had been flowing through it. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? The official report listed it as a murder-suicide. Thomas Carter, suffering from religious delusions, killed his family and then himself. Case closed. The house was sold at auction to a developer from Nashville who planned to tear it down and build something new. But 3 separate construction crews refused to work on the property. They said their tools wouldn't work right. They said they heard singing when no one was there. They said the ground felt wrong. The house still stands, empty, rotting, waiting. There was a 5th member of the Carter family, the one nobody talks about, the one who survived. Her name was Ruth Carter, and she was Thomas's sister, 51 years old, unmarried, partially deaf from a childhood illness. She'd been living with the family for 6 years, helping Margaret with the housework, with the children. But Ruth wasn't in the house on September 14, 1939. She was at the county hospital in Chattanooga, recovering from pneumonia. She'd been there for 2 weeks. The doctors said it was lucky timing. They said she'd dodged a bullet. Ruth didn't see it that way. When the sheriff finally tracked her down to tell her what happened, Ruth was sitting up in her hospital bed, her hands clasped in prayer. She'd been praying for 48 hours straight, the nurses said. Hadn't slept. Hadn't eaten. Just praying, her lips moving constantly, whispering the same words over and over. The nurses couldn't make out what she was saying. They thought it was just grief, just shock manifesting as religious fervor. Sheriff Womack sat beside her bed and told her everything as gently as he could. Her brother was dead. His wife was dead. All 3 children were dead. Ruth didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't react at all. She just kept praying, her eyes fixed on something in the middle distance, something nobody else could see. "Miss Ruth," Womack said softly, "did Thomas ever mention hearing voices? Did he talk about receiving messages?" Ruth's lips stopped moving. For the first time in 2 days, she stopped praying. She turned to look at Womack with eyes that were bloodshot from exhaustion, from lack of sleep, from something deeper than grief. "It wasn't Thomas," she whispered. Her voice was hoarse, raw. Thomas was the first to hear it, but it wasn't for him. It was never for him. "What do you mean?" Womack asked. "The voice," Ruth said. "It came through the radio, but it didn't come from the radio. It came from somewhere else. Somewhere." The older, Thomas thought it was God. He wanted so badly for it to be God. She started crying then, tears running down her weathered face. But God doesn't ask for those things. God doesn't give those instructions. Womack leaned forward. "What instructions, Miss Ruth? What did the voice tell them to do?" Ruth looked at him for a long moment. Then she started praying again. And she wouldn't stop, not for Womack, not for the doctors, not for anyone. She prayed through the night and into the next day. She prayed until her voice gave out completely, until she could only mouth the words silently. And even then, her lips kept moving. The hospital released her after a week, declared her physically healthy if emotionally traumatized. She had nowhere to go. The Carter house was a crime scene. She had no other family, no friends willing to take in a woman who couldn't stop praying. So, she ended up at Lakeview Asylum in Nashville, committed by the state as a charity case. The diagnosis was religious mania brought on by traumatic grief. But the staff at Lakeview knew it was something else. Something they didn't have words for. Ruth lived at Lakeview for 37 years. Every single day, from the moment she woke until exhaustion finally claimed her at night, she prayed. The same prayer, over and over. The staff wrote it down once, transcribed it phonetically because Ruth's voice was barely a whisper by then. It wasn't in English. It wasn't in any language the chaplain recognized. But the rhythm of it was familiar. It had the cadence of a prayer, the structure of a plea for protection. The other patients were terrified of her. They said Ruth's room was always cold, even in summer. They said shadows moved wrong around her, that they stretched toward her like they were trying to touch her but couldn't quite reach. They said that sometimes, late at night, you could hear something else in Ruth's room, not her voice, something answering. Ruth died in 1976, 77 years old. Her voice had been gone for decades, but her lips were still moving when the nurse found her body. Still praying, still trying to keep something at bay. The nurse who discovered her, a woman named Patricia Downing, requested a transfer to a different facility the next day. She never told anyone why, but her daughter found a journal after Patricia died in 2003. In it, Patricia had written about Ruth's final night. She wrote that when she entered Ruth's room to check on her, the air felt thick, oppressive, like breathing underwater. She wrote that Ruth's eyes were open, staring at the ceiling, and there was an expression of absolute terror on her face. But worse than that, Patricia wrote, was what she saw on the ceiling itself. For just a moment, just a split second before the light hit it fully, she saw writing, the same frantic script that had covered the Carter house, biblical verses twisted into shapes they were never meant to form. And then it was gone, just blank ceiling, just Ruth's body, finally still after 37 years of ceaseless prayer. The asylum burned Ruth's belongings, as was standard practice, but they buried her in the Millbrook Cemetery, not far from where the rest of the Carter family lay. The groundskeeper noted something odd. Birds wouldn't land near Ruth's grave. Trees wouldn't grow within 10 feet of it, and the grass, no matter how much care he gave it, always grew in strange patterns around her headstone. Spirals. The same spirals that had been carved into the walls of the Carter basement. The Carter house stood empty for 43 years. No one would buy it. No one would even go near it. The developer who'd purchased it at auction eventually just walked away, let the county take it back for unpaid taxes. In 1982, the town council voted to have it demolished. They hired a crew from Memphis, people who didn't know the history, didn't know what had happened there. The demolition lasted one day. The foreman, a man named Curtis Webb, brought his crew out on a Tuesday morning in June. They had bulldozers, wrecking equipment, everything they needed to level the place by sundown. Curtis told a reporter later that the job felt wrong from the moment they arrived. The air was different around that property. Heavier. His crew felt it too. 3 men refused to go inside the house to check the structure. Said they'd wait outside. Said they didn't care if they got docked pay. Curtis went in himself. The house had been empty for over 4 decades, but it didn't look abandoned. It looked inhabited. The dust was wrong, he said. Too evenly distributed. Like someone had been sweeping, and the writing on the walls, the writing that had been documented in 1939, was still there. 43 years of weather and decay, and those words hadn't faded at all. If anything, they looked fresher, darker. He was upstairs, checking the structural integrity of the second floor, when he heard it. Music. Faint at first, then growing louder. It was coming from downstairs. From the parlor. It sounded like a radio broadcast. Like one of those old gospel programs from the 30s and 40s. But there was no radio. There was no electricity. The house had been disconnected from the power grid in 1941. Curtis went downstairs. The music got louder with each step. By the time he reached the parlor, it was deafening. But it wasn't just music anymore. There were voices underneath it, singing the same hymn over and over. But the melody was incorrupted, bent into something that made his head throb. And then, underneath even that, he heard something else. A voice. Deep. Resonant. Speaking words that Curtis couldn't understand, but that filled him with a dread so profound he thought his heart might stop. He ran. Left his equipment. Left his crew. Got in his truck and drove. He never came back. Never sent anyone to retrieve his tools. The demolition was cancelled. The equipment sat there for 6 months before someone finally worked up the courage to haul it away. The house still stands today. The town of Millbrook doesn't talk about it. If you ask the older residents, they'll change the subject. If you ask the younger ones, they'll laugh it off as an urban legend, a ghost story parents tell to keep kids from trespassing. But nobody goes there. Not the teenagers looking for a thrill. Not the urban explorers documenting abandoned America. Not the paranormal investigators chasing evidence of the afterlife. Because something is still in that house. Something that doesn't want to be documented, doesn't want to be understood. In 2017, a YouTuber from California tried to film inside the Carter house. He'd done dozens of haunted location videos, had built a following exploring abandoned asylums and reportedly cursed properties. He arrived in Millbrook with 2 cameras and a cocky attitude. The locals warned him. He ignored them. He made it inside. He set up his cameras. He started filming. The footage was uploaded to his channel 3 days later. It ran for 8 minutes before cutting to black. In those 8 minutes, nothing happens. He walks through the house, making jokes, narrating for his audience. The walls are covered in writing, just like Curtis Webb described. The air is thick with dust. And then, at the 7-minute mark, he stops talking. He's in the parlor, standing in the exact spot where Thomas Carter died. And he's staring at something off camera. His face goes pale. His hands start shaking. The camera picks up audio, and you can hear it if you listen closely, if you turn the volume all the way up. Music. Faint, distorted, barely there. And underneath it, that voice. The same deep, resonant voice Curtis Webb heard. speaking words that sound almost like prayer but aren't, words that sound like they're coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The YouTuber drops the camera. The last 30 seconds of footage is just the ceiling, the sound of footsteps running, a door slamming, then static, then nothing. He deleted his channel 2 weeks later. Every video, years of content, gone. When someone finally tracked him down on social media to ask what happened, he responded with one sentence: "Don't go in that house. Whatever's there, it's still listening." The Carter family believed they heard God. They believed they were receiving divine instruction, that they were chosen for something holy and pure. But whatever spoke to them through that radio, whatever answered their prayers and gave them those terrible instructions, it wasn't holy. It was something older, something that understood faith could be weaponized, that devotion could be twisted into a key that opens doors that should stay closed. And it's still there, still waiting in that house on the outskirts of Millbrook, Tennessee, still whispering through the static, still looking for someone faithful enough, desperate enough, broken enough to listen. The Carters heard something claimed to be God. They believed it. They obeyed it. And in the end, it consumed them all. Every single one. Even Ruth, who spent 37 years trying to pray it away, trying to protect herself from whatever had spoken to her family. She died, still praying, still afraid, still hearing that voice in the darkness. The house is still there. The voice is still there. And somewhere in Millbrook, there's still a radio that no one will touch, buried in a storage unit that no one will open, wrapped in a cloth that someone in 1939 thought might contain it. They were wrong. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed. Some voices, once heard, can never be unheard. The Carter family learned that, and the town of Millbrook has spent 86 years making sure no one else has to. But every so often, someone new moves to town. Someone who doesn't know the history. Someone who finds that old radio at an estate sale or tucked in an attic. Someone who plugs it in, just to see if it still works. And in those moments, in the static between stations, something is still speaking, still calling out, still looking for someone to listen, still claiming to be God.